Hello, this is Like a Light Art, and today we are going to be taking a look at Monstergirls and where magic comes from in my world building project. This is less of an exact science than my previous video, at least with how I went about it, but that just means I can be a little bit weird. In this world, any explanation of monsters and magic has to start with an explanation on souls. We'll talk about souls, then magic, and then Monstergirls. Here's a soul. These little balls are filled with all the good stuff you want in you. They're the culmination of your will, memory, life, and magic. Every living thing has a soul, and without it, you would immediately die. However, not every soul is made equal. For instance, the soul of a flower is relatively powerless, whereas the soul of a long-lived wizard could weave intricate spells. It is commonly accepted among all cultures that souls come from a being I personally call the sleeping goddess. She dreams them into existence, and this is why the 8 sentient species look alike. They were all made in her image. There are many beliefs as to why she does this, ranging from a simple coincidence, a curse, or willful intention. In any case, it can be assumed that souls have magic power due to what originated them. Souls, as far as magic goes, have 2 qualities. The first is capacity, or depth. You can think of this like your maximum mana capacity in video games, but there's a slight twist to keep in mind. When you cast a spell, you're essentially skimming excess mana off the top. To continue casting spells after you've run out of excess mana is to use your soul as fuel. Doing so can quickly result in fatigue, amnesia, terminal illness, and even death. Should you survive, you may find that your soul's depth will never recover to what it was, and neither will your memory. This has led to many a tale of wizards who are mere empty husks operating on pure instinct. The second quality of a soul is its affinity, or the types of magic a soul can cast. The person's desires, personality, and memories are all engraved onto a soul over time, and this affects your soul's affinity. For example, someone who is gentle and loving their whole life will find their soul resists casting destructive spells. Even should they abandon all the kindness in their soul, it would take time to overwrite their previous affinity, and their destructive magic would be stunted for years. Culture can also affect this. Some have different ways of practicing magic, and this can engrave into your soul as well. For instance, in a culture where elemental magic is valued, having an affinity for fire may not be uncommon. While those 2 qualities stem from your soul, your body can affect your magic as well. How quickly your body can draw mana from your soul is called your mana output. For someone with low mana output, it would take hours to cast any large or powerful spell. This can be mitigated somewhat with group casting, which isn't an uncommon practice. Magic is, theoretically, omnipotent. As its power comes from a being far beyond the purview of mortals, it can do almost anything. Of course, a mortal soul is much too weak in practice. Its affinity and capacity naturally limit one's magic, and the body's mana output limits it further. Not only that, but even in magically inclined species, people with low capacity and low output are not uncommon. While you can train to increase your magic, that's easier said than done, and most could only hope to use magic as a lighter. But let's say we're looking at a grand wizard with amazing natural talent who's trained his entire life. What does magic look like for him and his unnaturally large beard? First off, magic is limited by your ability to understand and imagine what effect you're trying to produce. Humans, and indeed all other sentient species, have trouble picturing things that are too large or numerous. I mean, try picturing a house in its entirety, or even 100 individual pieces of candy. You can't, can you? Not all at once, at least. That's your pathetic mortal coil limiting your power once more. Therefore, conjuring something like a house or 1,000 swords would be difficult if not impossible to do all at once. So, since our wizard is a little baby, like you, his magic is restricted accordingly. Secondly, conjuring matter from thin air is incredibly mana inefficient. Even Gandalf here would have difficulty with it. So say you wanted to make a sword, for instance. It would be easier to use the magic to shape metal into a sword than it would be to use magic to conjure the sword itself. It would be even easier to manipulate air or water in the environment to slice through something, or to brute force it by launching the mana itself. In other words, Wizlin the wizard here should just send a flurry of concentrated pond water at you rather than waste energy conjuring a sword only to collapse after making the hilt at most. The final big limitation is that manipulating another person's soul is a very difficult thing to do. Things like resurrection, mind control, or soul transfer would all be very difficult, or even impossible to accomplish, because souls naturally resist outside manipulation. Sadly, this means no scrolls of resurrection for our wizard either. His parents are never coming back. All that being considered, magic is usually used for things like transportation, combat, and spectacle. Our wizard may not be able to generate gold, resurrect the dead, or instantly construct houses, but he could launch you up into the air and explode you like a firework, and that's awesome for him. It should also be said that some non-sentient animals can also cast magic. However, the complexity and power of these is very limited. The final topic with magic is the concept of power spots. It's believed there used to be a race of giants with grand souls capable of world-shaping magic. Where these folks died, their souls distorted the flow of mana in ways that would be impossible for our species. These disruptions can even influence reality, or even your very soul. Some of these are innocuous, only vaguely affecting the surroundings. Some can enhance your soul's power, or grant you affinities you lacked, and some will simply curse and kill you. Now on to the sentient species. There are 8 in total, all of which are roughly as intelligent and emotive as the others. None are explicitly good or evil. I felt that 8 was a good balance between variety and having too many to keep track of, but I'm not entirely against adding more if it seems doable. My first goal with these designs was that not one would be better than any other. Think of elves, for instance. I feel that in many fantasy shows, elves are just way cooler than humans. Sometimes they have a hard time having kids to balance it out, but that hardly seems like a big deal to me. So I tried to make each species have things they're better at. My second goal was that none should be too similar to humans. Once again, elves suck. They're boring to me. While the enhanced lifespans can shift their culture, they're not all that different mechanically in most depictions. That's why I like demi-humans the most. I've always craved more solid world building surrounding their cultures and biology, which, in my experience at least, is rarely given special attention. In fact, that's why I started this project in the first place. Let's start by introducing humans into the setting. I hope you're familiar. If not, try going outside, maybe touch grass or something. In this world, they are beings with average capabilities native to the central southern continent. While they can't do anything special, their high adaptability means they tend to be very common. The next species we'll talk about is the demons, arguably the most similar to humans in this world. Well, the fact that they live longer and have far higher magical output may at first make them seem better than humans. Their bodies are very fragile. They take a long time to mature, and until they do so, they are very vulnerable to disease and injury. Furthermore, their magic abilities are tied directly to their horns, and should they be permanently damaged, the demon may never recover physically or magically. All of this means that they actually have low average lifespans despite being capable of living much longer than others. Next up is merfolk. While many merfolk are fish-like, bearing gills, I consider mine to be more like marine mammals, like dolphins or whales. This means that they give live birth and they need to surface for air. I've struggled a lot with whether or not they should have legs for land travel, but for now I'm settling on them being legless. They can hold their breath for 20 minutes at a time underwater, On land, they begin to dry out and die after a few hours. While they mostly live in the water, they've been known to come out frequently for mating, trading, foraging, or just for fun. On average, they are the largest of the sentient species, their tail adding much body length and having naturally blubbery bodies like seals or whales. They live slightly longer than humans, averaging 88 years worldwide as opposed to 72. They have been known to live on every coastline in the world, and even some rivers and lakes. Harpies are birdfolk. Despite Greek mythology, they are not exclusively female. The males also tend to be more colorful. They are the second smallest species, and their bones are lightweight like birds, both being adaptations for flight. Their souls even are adapted for this, as they seem to counteract the weight of their bodies. In fact, harpies immediately gain weight after death. This leads them to be somewhat more fragile than humans, but they are the quickest and most agile of all the species. Like birds, they lay eggs as opposed to live births, about 2 to 3 a year in place of having a period. Having wings instead of arms can be troublesome, but this isn't as big of a deal as you might think, as their feet are dexterous enough to be used in place of hands. They live only slightly shorter lives than humans, averaging 70 as opposed to 72 worldwide. They originate in the southeastern continent. Driders are spider people native to the northeastern continent with the demons. The name comes from D&D, in which they are dark elves who dated a spider god or something, and it screwed up their buttocks. But as I hate elves, that is not where these guys come from. These folk are somewhat smaller in comparison to humans. Though they aren't poisonous, they can spin webs, which they often use in their homes, clothing, and tools. This makes it a natural export for their societies. Their sharp claws lend themselves to digging, so many societies make their cities partly or entirely underground. This predilection for digging and nocturnality has led them to have the worst vision, but their other senses far exceed a human's. Like spiders, they lay eggs as opposed to live births, but only 2 on average as opposed to the hundreds of actual spiders. Between sharp claws, large populations, better than average magic, and thick skin, they are naturally gifted warriors. They also live only 64 years on average, being the shortest lived species. Lepidoptera are mothfolk, which I named after the order moths and butterflies hail from, Lepidoptera. They are the smallest of all the species. Much like moths, they undergo metamorphosis, though this usually happens in their teens. They can decline to go through metamorphosis, but most have a natural and intense urge to do so. Their diets are the most unique among the species, setting aside the arcana, who we will get to. While they can eat meat, they have a natural tendency towards herbivory. Once they enter their moth form, they can even digest organic fibers and softer woods, which are commonplace in their dishes. While real moths freeze to death in the winter, these creatures are well adapted for the cold, and originated in the far south. Though capable of flight, they tend to be slow and have difficulty with great distances, so walking is preferable to most. They do lay eggs, laying 1 or 2 at a time, but their lifespans are the second shortest, averaging 67 years old. Furthermore, as they have 4 arms, I bet they could make absolutely sick drum solos. The next species is perhaps the strangest. Arcana are made of animated magical energy, like a soul fire elemental. As a result, they're partially incorporeal and pass through physical objects that aren't imbued with magic beforehand. To alleviate this, they enchant armor through repeated contact, until eventually they bind to it and become living suits of armor. They have no sex, and reproduce by combining pieces of themselves with 1 or more partners. They can also eat by absorbing residual magical energy from living creatures. While you think being made of magic would mean they are excellent magicians, this is not the case. Firstly, they lack a physical medium with which to focus magic energy and must use an external catalyst. Secondly, using spells chip away at their very bodies, shrinking or dismembering parts of themselves, though they will grow the mass back with time. So, while their constitution leads to extreme capacity for magic, They find spells are inefficient, weak, and even detrimental to cast. As a result, Arcana mages are the rarest of all mages, but are equally powerful and determined beings. They originate from a power spot in the southwestern continent and live the longest of any species thanks to their magic bodies being resistant to direct harm and illness. An Arcana living to 180 years old is not entirely unheard of. As they age, their souls lose the ability to manifest a body until eventually only the soul remains. Similar to the Arcana, slimes are made of animated magical energy. However, unlike Arcana, which are pure magic, slimes were formed by a corpse being dissolved and animated by the magic. This means that the density of their magic is lower in comparison, and that they have a more physical body. Inside of them is a core, typically a vital organ of the creature that was dissolved, and sometimes pieces of the skeleton, which is harder to dissolve. As their skeleton is typically incomplete, slimes frequently bind shells or other containers to keep their core safe. Some of these are quite unnecessarily large. Their magic capacity is second only to Arcana, but their output is only marginally better. However, overusing their magic even slightly can kill them instantly, as the barrier holding together their body would immediately dispel and they would turn into a puddle of goop. They reproduce similarly to Arcana, splitting parts of themselves off with one or more partners. However, they have the additional requirement of a corpse to dissolve. As they age, their core will slowly rot, and their body will begin to slowly fall apart. On average, they live to be 109 years old. They originate from a power spot on the northwestern continent. This might sound a bit weird, but can different species have kids together? No. Hear me out here. I had pondered this question for a while. On one hand, it wouldn't explicitly make sense if different species could have children together. That can happen sometimes in the wild, like with lions and tigers, but these species are much more alike than, say, Lepidoptera and demons are. However, if I say no, that to some extent discourages interaction between species because populations can't finally mix. I like the idea of them interacting and forming societies together, and I want to encourage it. Therefore, I decided that it can happen, but then, do the species mix? Can mixed species have children as well? Okay, that's nasty. To make it a little easier, I've decided that they always take after the mother species. In case of the slimes and Arcana, who are technically sexless, they can reproduce with one another, but not with the other species. My reasoning is basically that though their bodies are different, the souls of the sentient species are extremely similar, and having children mainly relies on that rather than genetics. I'm not entirely sure on this idea, however, so it might change later on. Species and race are very different concepts. Species imply that the biological differences are very significant. Races, however, imply that the differences are minuscule, mainly referring to appearance. Races reflect little to no difference and are mainly a social construct. So, races are poor terms to describe fantasy species, as they are significantly different biologically. That's kind of a pet peeve of mine. Therefore, each of my species has its own races. Some Drider populations may have different markings, or be darker in color, or slightly larger than others. Some demon populations may have different horn shapes, and some harpies may have distinct wing colorations. Thus, to touch the topic of discrimination, someone who discriminates against harpies as a whole would be specious. However, someone who discriminates against harpies with fair skin and brown feathers specifically would be racist. Of course, you can be both at once, but it's an additional dynamic that may significantly affect societal structure. However, I want to emphasize that the species are largely the same regarding behavior and mental capacity. In other words, any large-scale differences should result directly from how their biology informs their culture, rather than an inherent difference in their mind. With all of that done, we've got the foundations of the world finished. I might look at ecology, at least in broad terms, before continuing on the history and cultures, but I haven't decided. Also, wow, as of recording this, the first episode has over 400 views. I want to thank everybody who commented the kind words. I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's so true. But seriously, I was really surprised by how many people ended up watching it. I'll try not to get my hopes up too much, but subscribe, and then give me all of your money. Thank you for watching.